Calum Hargreaves, and Arbin Kodra never imagined their paths would collide on Liverpool streets. But when ambition met strategy, a silent war began, one that would change the city forever. Please subscribe and share for daily new update of gang crime story and watch till end. Liverpool had always been a city of movement. Ships came and went, lorries rolled through narrow roads near the docks, and money changed hands faster than anyone could track. On the surface, everything looked normal. Tourists walked the waterfront, pubs stayed busy, and the nights glowed with city lights. But beneath that familiar rhythm, a hidden structure controlled parts of the city that never appeared on maps. This structure was not built overnight. It grew slowly, silently, over years of careful planning and calculated risk. The local gang operated without banners or public displays of power. They avoided unnecessary violence and never drew attention to themselves. Their influence spread through transport routes, storage facilities, and cash-based businesses that looked harmless from the outside. At the center of this network was Calum Hargreaves, a man who believed that control came from patience, not chaos. He understood Liverpool's streets, its people, and its weaknesses. Every operation followed a pattern, every move had a reason, and every member knew that mistakes were not forgiven. For a long time, the system worked perfectly. Rivals stayed away, either bought off or quietly pushed out. Police pressure remained low because nothing appeared out of place. There were no public feuds, no reckless acts, and no noise. The gang blended into the city like shadows at dusk. They did not need to prove themselves because everyone who mattered already knew who truly controlled the flow beneath the city. The first sign of trouble did not come with violence or threats. It came with absence. A routine shipment failed to arrive at its destination. No alarms were triggered, no evidence was left behind. At first, it seemed like a simple mistake, but then another delivery vanished, followed by a delay in payments that had never failed before. These were small disruptions, easy to ignore, yet deeply unsettling. The system had always been predictable. Now it wasn't. Soon, unfamiliar faces were noticed near areas that had always been secure. They did not act suspiciously. They did not ask questions. They observed. Their presence felt calculated, as if they were measuring the city rather than living in it. Long-time contacts began acting distant. Old routines no longer felt safe. The streets had not changed, but something beneath them had shifted. Calum sensed the danger before anyone else fully understood it. This was not a local threat. Liverpool gangs fought loudly, making their presence known. This was different. The pressure was invisible, strategic, and disciplined. Someone was entering the city without asking permission, and they were doing it carefully. There were no warnings, no demands, and no signs of compromise. Just quiet interference that chipped away at control. As days passed, tension grew inside the gang. Members watched each other more closely. Trust became fragile. The sense of unity that once defined them began to crack. No one knew where the threat was coming from, which made it more dangerous. Liverpool had always respected strength. But now strength was being tested by something smarter, colder, and far more patient. By the time Calum realized this was the beginning of a larger invasion, it was already too late. The city had welcomed a new force without even noticing. The streets still looked calm, but the war had already begun, silently unfolding beneath Liverpool's glowing skyline. The group behind the sudden changes did not arrive in Liverpool by accident. Their move into the city was part of a wider expansion spreading quietly across Europe. They chose Liverpool for its ports, its history of trade, and its busy transport routes that connected the UK to the outside world. Unlike local gangs, they did not rely on reputation or street fear. They relied on structure, planning, and discipline. Their operation was designed to grow without being seen. At the center of this expansion was Arbin Kodra, a man who rarely needed to show his authority. He stayed far from street-level activity, allowing others to handle the visible work while he focused on strategy. Every step taken by his network was calculated. They avoided conflict, choosing observation over action. Liverpool was treated like a puzzle, and each piece was studied carefully before being touched. The Albanian Mafia did not move as one large group. They entered in fragments, blending into the city's rhythm. Some took legitimate jobs, others invested in businesses that already existed. They learned the routes used by local gangs, the times operations ran, and the people who mattered most. Nothing was rushed. Mistakes were unacceptable. This patience made them nearly invisible. Instead of attacking Liverpool's dominant gang directly, they applied pressure in subtle ways. Small financial disruptions were introduced where they would cause confusion but not panic. Trusted suppliers were approached quietly and offered better terms. Old agreements were tested and weakened. The goal was not immediate control but uncertainty. When people feel unsure, they become vulnerable. Arbin understood that power in a new city could not be taken by force alone. It had to be accepted, or at least tolerated. His network avoided drawing police attention, keeping violence off the streets. This made their presence difficult to detect. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. Inside the criminal world, however, balance was slowly shifting. As weeks passed, the local Liverpool gang began reacting without understanding the source of the problem. They tightened control, incensed pressure on their own contacts, and demanded loyalty where trust once existed naturally. These reactions played directly into the Albanian strategy. Stress caused mistakes, fear exposed weaknesses. Every internal crack became a doorway. Unknown to the Liverpool gang, one of their own had already been identified as a pressure point. This individual was not turned through threats, but through opportunity. The Albanian Mafia offered protection, stability, and a future beyond the constant tension of street life. That single connection allowed them to map the local network in detail. Safe routes, storage locations, and financial paths were quietly revealed. By the time the Liverpool gang sensed betrayal, the damage was already done. Their movements were predictable. Their reactions were expected. Arbin's operation did not need to rush toward dominance. Control was forming naturally as the old structure weakened itself from within. Liverpool remained loud and alive above ground, unaware that its underworld was being rewritten. What felt like minor disruption was actually the foundation of a takeover built on patience, silence, and careful observation. The street war had not yet shown its face, but its shadow was already stretching across the city. The pressure that had once felt distant now began to settle heavily inside the Liverpool gang. Daily routines that were once automatic required constant checking. Locations were changed without explanation, movements delayed, and instructions repeated more than necessary. This sudden shift created confusion rather than security. Members who had trusted the structure for years started questioning decisions, unsure whether they were protecting themselves or exposing more weakness. Calum Hargreaves noticed the change in behavior before anyone openly admitted it. Small signs appeared everywhere. People avoided eye contact. Information arrived late or incomplete. Tasks that were once handled smoothly now caused tension. The gang had survived many challenges before, but this was different. The danger did not come from an outside threat they could confront. It came from uncertainty within their own ranks. Unseen by most, the Albanian Mafia was already guiding events from a distance. They did not push the Liverpool gang into collapse. They allowed it to unravel naturally. Each internal argument, each moment of doubt, made the structure weaker. Arbin understood that fear was most effective when it had no clear source. The Liverpool gang was fighting an enemy they could not see. The insider connection began shaping decisions quietly. Suggestions were planted at the right moments. Certain routes were described as risky, while others were encouraged. These subtle changes redirected operations into areas that were easier to monitor. Nothing appeared suspicious because the ideas came from within. What looked like loyalty was actually guidance leading the gang into exposed positions. Soon, safe houses that had remained untouched for years became compromised. Storage locations were no longer secure, though no one could explain why. Supplies went missing without leaving evidence. Every loss felt random, but the pattern was clear to those watching closely. The Liverpool gang was being studied in real time, their reactions measured and predicted. As pressure increased, Calum tightened his grip, believing discipline would restore order. Instead, the opposite happened. Increased control created resentment. Members felt watched rather than protected. Long-standing loyalty was replaced by survival instincts. People began thinking about exits, not futures. This emotional shift was exactly what the Albanian Mafia expected. The turning point came when a key operation failed without warning. No police interference was detected, and no rival gang claimed responsibility. The failure forced emergency changes that exposed even more internal confusion. Panic spread quickly, but quietly. Everyone sensed they were losing control, yet no one knew how or to whom. Behind the scenes, Arben's network expanded its influence with calm precision. They did not celebrate small victories. Each success was simply another step forward. Their real achievement was not the losses suffered by the Liverpool gang, but the loss of confidence. Once belief in leadership weakened, the structure became fragile. By the end of this phase, the Liverpool gang still existed, but it no longer felt solid. It moved like a body unsure of its balance, reacting instead of planning. The war had not erupted into violence, but its effects were already visible. The streets were watching, waiting for the moment when silent pressure would finally break into open conflict. The first violent incident did not erupt in the center of the city or under bright lights. It happened on the edge of Liverpool's industrial zones, where warehouses stood quiet after midnight and cameras rarely worked properly. What made it shocking was not just the damage left behind, but the precision with which it was carried out. The operation was fast, controlled, and gone before anyone could react. By morning, the scene told a story that pointed in the wrong direction. Evidence was left behind in a way that suggested an internal dispute. Markings, timing, and movement patterns all matched the Liverpool gang's past methods. It looked like a collapse from within. A power struggle turned violent. Rumors spread quickly through the underworld. Whispers suggested betrayal, leadership failure, and loss of control. The Albanian Mafia remained invisible, exactly as planned. Police activity increased almost immediately. Patrols near the docks became more frequent. Unmarked vehicles appeared in places they hadn't before. This sudden attention forced the Liverpool gang to shut down several operations overnight. Income slowed, pressure increased, and mistakes became harder to hide. What was meant to look like a single violent act triggered a chain reaction that weakened the gang further. Inside the group, suspicion exploded. Everyone searched for someone to blame. Longtime allies became potential threats. Information was restricted, which only made coordination worse. Decisions were delayed because no one trusted the process anymore. The unity that once defined the gang was replaced by silence and guarded behavior. The structure was still standing, but its foundation was cracking fast. From a distance, Arben Kodra watched the effect unfold without interference. The incident had achieved its purpose. It forced the Liverpool gang into isolation while increasing law enforcement pressure. No further action was needed for the moment. The chaos would feed itself. Fear always did. As days passed, the city absorbed the shock. Media reports hinted at rising gang tension without naming names. Residents near affected areas felt uneasy, sensing something had shifted. Criminal networks across Liverpool took note and began adjusting their own positions. Some pulled back, others waited, ready to move when power finally changed hands. The Liverpool gang attempted damage control, but their efforts lacked coordination. Old channels no longer worked. Contacts refused to respond. Money that once moved smoothly now stalled at every step. Each attempt to regain control revealed how much ground had already been lost. The city that once obeyed quietly was now watching closely. What made the situation more dangerous was the lack of clarity. There was no clear enemy to confront, no demand to negotiate, no line to draw. The violence felt like a warning without a message. That uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone involved. Fear without direction is far more destructive than fear with a target. By the end of this phase, the street war had finally shown its face, but only briefly. It disappeared as quickly as it arrived, leaving behind confusion, suspicion, and growing police attention. Liverpool's Underworld stood at the edge of open conflict, unaware that the most damaging moves had already been made in silence. The pressure reached a point where inaction felt more dangerous than risk. With resources shrinking and trust nearly gone, Liverpool gang decided that showing strength was the only way to survive. The move was rushed, driven by frustration rather than strategy. Information used to plan the response was incomplete, shaped by fear and false assumptions. What was meant to be a calculated strike became a dangerous gamble. The retaliation was aimed at a location believed to be connected to the unseen enemy. It was chosen based on patterns that no longer reflected reality. When the operation was carried out, it caused disruption, but not to the people responsible for the earlier damage. Instead, it exposed the Liverpool gang's remaining capabilities, methods, and reach. For those watching closely, it revealed far more than intended. The Albanian Mafia had anticipated this reaction. They understood that a wounded organization would act impulsively. Rather than responding with immediate violence, they used the moment to tighten their grip. Routes that the Liverpool gang depended on were blocked overnight. Financial channels were frozen through quiet pressure and influence. Key figures who managed money and logistics disappeared from the picture without public incident. The effect was immediate and devastating. Operations that once moved smoothly came to a halt. Members found themselves waiting for instructions that never arrived. Resources ran low, and uncertainty deepened. The streets sensed the change. Businesses that once paid quietly began hesitating. Fear shifted direction, moving away from the Liverpool gang and toward the unknown force replacing it. Within the gang, morale collapsed. Loyalty had already been weakened, but now belief in survival itself was fading. Some members stopped showing up. Others acted independently, making reckless decisions that only drew more attention. The structure that had taken years to build was now collapsing in weeks. Every attempt to regain control only highlighted how much power had already been lost. Meanwhile, the Albanian Mafia expanded calmly. They filled the gaps left behind, offering stability where chaos remained. Their approach was controlled and disciplined. There was no celebration, no unnecessary exposure. Control was established not through fear alone, but through reliability. In a city where uncertainty ruled, consistency became power. Calum Hargreaves found himself isolated. Messages went unanswered. Plans fell apart before they could begin. The authority he once held no longer carried weight. The city that once moved according to his quiet rules was now shifting toward a new order. The realization was slow but unavoidable. The war was being lost without a final fight. What made this stage particularly dangerous was the illusion of choice. The Liverpool gang believed they still had options, but every path forward had already been anticipated. Each move played directly into the larger strategy controlling the streets. The retaliation meant to restore fear instead confirmed weakness. By the end of this chapter, the street war had taken a clear direction. The balance of power was no longer uncertain. The Liverpool gang was fading into the background, while a new force moved forward without resistance. The final stages were approaching, and the outcome was no longer in doubt. Just when it appeared that the Albanian Mafia had secured complete control, an unexpected shift began forming beneath the surface. The street war had created noise, confusion, and movement, and that chaos had not gone unnoticed. While both sides focused on survival and dominance, another presence had been quietly observing from a distance, gathering details without interfering. This presence did not belong to the street. For months, law enforcement had been monitoring unusual patterns around the docks, transport routes, and financial networks. What made the situation valuable was the speed at which changes were happening. Routes were being abandoned, new ones formed, and connections rearranged. Every reaction left behind traces. The silent war between criminal groups created opportunities for observation that would not exist during stable time. A key development emerged with the return of Elliot Crane, a former Liverpool gang associate believed to have left the city permanently. His reappearance did not attract attention on the streets, but it mattered deeply behind closed doors. Elliot carried knowledge of old routes, hidden locations, and financial methods that no longer matched what was happening now. That contrast exposed the scale of change and helped confirm suspicions already forming within investigative circles. Elliot's movements revealed something both criminal groups had overlooked. The disruption was no longer limited to gang conflict. Surveillance was tightening, financial tracking had become more precise, and minor legal pressure was being applied in ways that appeared random but followed a clear pattern. What looked like coincidence was actually preparation. As the Albanian Mafia continued consolidating control, they failed to recognize that their efficiency was creating visibility. Organized systems leave trails, and rapid expansion increases exposure. Every new connection strengthened the structure, but also made it easier to map. The very discipline that had given them power was now working against them. On the other side, the remaining Liverpool gang members unknowingly provided valuable information through their panic. Sudden changes in behavior, rushed movements, and abandoned locations helped fill in gaps. Each attempt to disappear only highlighted where they had been before. The city was becoming transparent to those watching closely. The street war that had never fully exploded into chaos was now reaching its most dangerous stage. Neither side realized that the environment had changed. The threat was no longer coming from across the street or from within the organization. It was surrounding them quietly, tightening without urgency. By the time this reality began to surface, it was already too late to react. Control over the streets no longer mattered as much as control over evidence. The war had shifted from shadowed warehouses and quiet deals to something far more permanent. The final outcome would not be decided by fear or force, but by timing. What both sides believed was a victory or a defeat was actually a setup. The city had allowed the conflict to dwindle just long enough for every piece to fall into place. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the calm before a decisive collapse that neither group could escape. The night the raids began, Liverpool was eerily quiet. Streetlights glowed over empty roads, and the usual hum of activity near the docks was absent. Neither the Liverpool gang nor the Albanian Mafia had anticipated the scale of what was about to happen. In hours, decades of careful planning, silent invasions, and subtle manipulations would unravel in ways neither side could control. The city had become a trap they had walked into unknowingly. Police units moved with precision, striking multiple locations almost simultaneously. Warehouses that had once been considered safe were breached. Hidden storage rooms, offices, and offshore connections were all targeted. Everything the gangs relied on to operate smoothly, cash flows, transport routes, and communication channels was systematically dismantled. What had been a street war fought in shadows was suddenly exposed under intense scrutiny. For the Albanian Mafia, the raids came as a shock. Their careful patience and meticulous planning had not accounted for this sudden interference. The power they thought was solid began slipping. Members who had felt invincible were caught off guard, assets frozen, key figures arrested or monitored, and safe houses compromised. The very methods that had given them dominance became vulnerabilities in an instant. Their quiet takeover was being erased by a force they had never seen coming. The Liverpool gang, weakened and fragmented, faced total collapse. Many members were taken by surprise, having believed that their knowledge of the city gave them immunity. Those who had survived the initial pressure now confronted a new reality. They were outmatched, not just by rivals, but by the reach and planning of law enforcement. Their streets, once theirs by instinct and fear, no longer obeyed them. The game had changed, and the rules were no longer theirs to dictate. Throughout the night, operations that once moved like clockwork fell apart, deliveries failed, cash transfers were intercepted, and communication lines were cut. Members who had trusted each other now realized the fragility of their networks. Panic, though silent, spread through both groups. What had been tension and fear became certainty. The street war had ended, not with explosions or gunfire, but with containment and exposure. Observers from the city watched carefully, noting the absence of the usual violence. Streets that had been dangerous were suddenly quiet. The shadow of gangs remained, but their influence had been removed from active control. Criminal networks that had once seemed untouchable were now in custody, under surveillance or forced into hiding. Liverpool had regained a semblance of order, but it was fragile and new. The raids demonstrated a final twist in the saga. No side had won the war in the way they imagined. The Albanian Mafia had failed to take control, and the Liverpool gang had been dismantled. Yet power in the city did not vanish entirely. It shifted to an unseen force, one that operated with patience, precision, and legality rather than bullets. By the end of the night, the story of dominance, betrayal, and silent war was over in the streets, but it lived on in investigations, court files, and whispers among the underworld. The quiet that followed was deceptive, leaving the city safe for now but reminding everyone that power, no matter how absolute it feels, can vanish overnight. The war had ended not with noise, but with inevitability. Liverpool slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the city had changed in ways that could not be seen on the surface. The streets that had once echoed with whispers of gang activity were quieter, yet a tension lingered in the corners and alleyways. People moved with an extra awareness, cautious of shadows that might carry the memory of past violence. The docks remained operational, deliveries resumed, and businesses reopened, but everyone involved in the underworld understood that the balance of power had shifted permanently. The Albanian Mafia, once a looming threat, had been stalled. Their expansion stopped abruptly, leaving operations half-completed and ambitions unmet. Members who had arrived in Liverpool quietly and with discipline found themselves exposed to law enforcement and unable to continue their strategy. The careful patience that had been their greatest weapon turned into a liability under sudden scrutiny. Some disappeared, returning to Europe, while others were taken into custody or forced to operate underground, invisible and cautious. For the Liverpool gang, the aftermath was bitter and irreversible. Survivors moved quietly, no longer able to rely on networks that had once been theirs by reputation alone. Their influence had crumbled, trust had been destroyed, and opportunities for reclaiming streets had vanished. The city that had obeyed their unspoken rules now functioned independently of their fear, leaving a vacuum that could no longer be filled. Those who remained learned to adapt, avoiding confrontation and staying under the radar, forever aware that past dominance was only temporary. The city itself became a witness to the consequences of silent conflict. While ordinary citizens were largely unaware of the scale of events, the scars of the war lingered in patterns of cautious behavior. Taxi drivers, warehouse workers, and shopkeepers moved differently, aware that the calm was fragile. Criminal networks across Liverpool adapted quickly, recognizing the lessons of failure. Influence now required more subtlety, patience, and strategy, rather than outright intimidation. The streets were no longer ruled by those who shouted loudest. They were controlled by those who understood the hidden consequences of each move. The story of the Liverpool gang versus the Albanian Mafia became a cautionary tale in whispers, files, and rote reports. Law enforcement had turned chaos into opportunity, demonstrating that crime, no matter how disciplined, always leaves traces. The operations of both sides were dissected, evidence catalogued, and lessons learned. The once invincible players were now subjects of investigation, leaving behind a narrative that highlighted the fragility of power, the importance of loyalty, and the dangers of overconfidence. In the end, the war had not concluded with a dramatic showdown, but with quiet inevitability. No side achieved total victory. The Albanian Mafia had failed to dominate. The Liverpool gang had lost what they once controlled. The city itself survived, stronger in structure yet haunted by memories of silent war and hidden battles. Power in Liverpool proved to be fleeting, fragile, and unpredictable. As life returned to the surface, the streets carried the memory of what had transpired. The docks, warehouses, and narrow lanes had witnessed a war fought without witnesses, resolved without public spectacle. In the shadows, lessons remained. Patience, observation, and subtlety often outlast brute force, and the calm that follows chaos is never guaranteed to last forever. Liverpool moved on, but the echoes of betrayal, strategy, and silent power battles continued to shape its streets for years to come.